All right, we're here for part two. Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you very much for working today from home to get this class going. Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you join us for the second lesson.
Okay.
And I don't know why you can't get that volume up a little higher. Is there anything else that's?
No.
If
Carol, could you please mute yourself?
There's nothing else plugged in. You took out the earphones.
Carol,
But
you need to mute yourself.
now, if you have a question or want to make a comment, I would suggest that you use the chat feature, which is somewhere on your menu. You can click in that and type in a question, make a comment. And at the end of the lesson, I will go through all of those questions and comments if there are any, and take additional comments if we have time. Last week, we got to the point where the United States forces had, okay, got my slides going, had hit a couple of places around the periphery of the Japanese empire as it had been expanded greatly. But what our government and leaders, and especially the naval leaders, wanted to do was to hit Japan itself. And as we discussed last week, there was just nowhere to do it. China would have been a good place, not all that far to go. Some airfields that we'd be able to use. The only way to get planes and fuel to China would be over the very high and difficult Himalaya mountains, later called the hump. So we couldn't use China. The places that we controlled, Midway, Hawaii, Australia, were too far from Japan. We could do it with aircraft carriers, but a carrier would have to get so close that once the Japanese became aware that an attack was coming or underway, they could very easily use land-based airplanes to do considerable damage and quite likely destroy the carrier fleet. So what to do? Well, Admiral King, who was in charge of the Navy, had the top two posts in the Navy, was approached by one of his staff who had been at an Army Air Corps base where they were training with a fairly new airplane, a B-26 bomber. And one of its principal features was that it operated very well off of short airfields. The design, I'm sure, assumed capture of small islands and jungle areas in the Pacific where you couldn't have a very long airfield. So this plane had terrific characteristics for short airfields. And he thought, well, this plane where they're taking off is no longer than the space on an aircraft carrier. So this plane could take off from an aircraft carrier, which was far enough from Japan for the carrier to be protected from counterattack, and get somewhere beyond Russia or to China, bombing the Japanese in between. Now, they couldn't land on the carrier. The plane was too big for that, but if they could get to Japan and then on to Russia or China, it was a way to strike at the Japanese homeland. Well, Admiral King was very enthusiastic about this. He talked to General Hap Arnold, who was head of the Army Air Corps.
Sorry, Bill Allen, returning your call. So I just give me a call back at your convenience. My office numbers.
Somebody has their microphone on who was just on a cell phone. If you would switch your mic off, we'd appreciate it. Thanks a lot. They went to General Arnold, the head of the Army Air Corps, gave him the idea. He liked it. He thought, yeah, let's look into it further. Well, he assigned his assistant to look at it further. His assistant was then a lieutenant colonel named Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was probably the most famous man in the Army Air Corps because while he was in the Air Corps after World War I, he became a very good aircraft racer. He raced float planes, land planes. He won a lot of races. He did that for the Air Corps for several years, mainly publicity. And then he made a lot more money leaving the Air Corps, doing it for corporations who would sponsor him. Well, Doolittle came back into the Air Corps and became Arnold's assistant. He was given this idea. He loved it. He thought that we should do it. They started planning it, working with the crews of B-25s. He went to an Air Force base where they were training, found the ones who had the most experience, and I'd like volunteers for a mission that I can't tell you a word about, but it's going to be very dangerous. And every one of them volunteered. And they refined the plan. They would come about a little less than 500 miles from Japan, bringing the planes on an aircraft carrier. The B-25s would launch from the carrier, fly to Japan, bomb it, and go on somewhere. The place they'd like to go was Russia because it was a much shorter distance. Russia, after all, was our ally. We were providing them lots of lend-lease equipment, but in the strange world of international relations, Russia and Japan were at peace, and the Russians feared an invasion by the Japanese. They were locked in deadly combat with the Germans in Europe. And so the Russians said, no, we're sorry, we'd like to help, but we cannot take the chance on irritating the Japanese. So the landings were planned in China. There would be several airfields that would be lit up at the time that the aviators were coming from Japan, and they'd be able to land there and refuel and get their planes back to the United States, at least the ones that might survive this operation. But Doolittle got really deep into this. I did not want to lose him, wanted to keep him in Washington, but he tricked Arnold into agreeing to let him command this operation. And Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle was, in fact, assigned to command the operation. I'm getting one of those messages that you really love to get on a Zoom session. It says your internet connection is unstable. So I hope you all are, somebody wave to me if you can, if you're still hearing me and saying the slides.
You're still live,
Gary,
Mike.
can you? Okay. All right. They flew the planes to California and landed at the Alameda Naval Base, taxied the planes to the dock, and much to the surprise of the pilots who had been told nothing even now about what the mission was. Their planes were loaded on the aircraft carrier Hornet. This was done in broad daylight, and they sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge. A lot of people could have seen and certainly did see this, but would probably not be a big surprise to people much familiar with military operations, because from time to time, aircraft were ferried on aircraft carriers. They were taken from one place to another, not to fly off of the carrier, but to be delivered to somewhere on land. Well, they got underway. Finally, they were told what the mission was. You got to wonder what the pilots were thinking about when they found out, because none of these pilots, including Doolittle, had ever taken off from an aircraft carrier. They had taken off a lot of times from short airfields, aircraft carrier. They were on the carrier Hornet, and these two very interesting people, Jimmy Doolittle, who we've talked about, Mark Mitchell, who was the captain of the aircraft carrier Hornet. Now, these are both of them were very short people. Mr. in particular was skinny. He was lightweight. He had a light complexion. He was always getting bad sunburns. He went to the Naval Academy. 2 years, he was a poor student. He was a discipline problem. Finally, after 2 years, he was sent away. He was terminated at the Naval Academy. Well, he had enough influence to get back, but they required him to start over. So he spent 6 years at the Naval Academy. And when he went on active duty, as soon as he could, he was fascinated by aircraft. And this was something that his physique was perfect for, because in those days, before World War I, airplanes were cloth wings. They were light, and being light in weight and small was a benefit to someone. Well, he stayed in naval aviation, worked his way up, and just become the commanding officer of carrier Hornet. It was said that his classmates at the academy, from the academy, were astounded that he had not only made the rank of captain, but gotten command of a major ship. But here they were, an unlikely pair on a very unlikely mission. Now, in the middle of the Pacific, or north of Hawaii, they were joined by the carrier Enterprise. And that group was commanded by Admiral William Halsey, who we had already met once in this course. Halsey was then a vice admiral in charge of all naval aviation and the Pacific Fleet. They had to bring the Enterprise because the Hornet would not be able to use its own aircraft. They were all stowed on the hangar deck, so that the U.S. Army B-25s could be carried. So the Enterprise joined, and Halsey took command of the entire operation, and they proceeded on toward Japan. They refueled one time and then sent the tankers back and went at fairly high speed toward the launch point. Now, they were not quite, they were a couple hundred miles really from where they wanted to launch when they were discovered. One thing the Japanese had done after these early raids was to put picket boats out They were mainly small wooden fishing boats, were there just to spot exactly what one of them did. U.S. ships heading for the mainland of Japan. Well, Halsey at that point said that he was very much concerned about getting any closer since they had been discovered. And Doolittle agreed that they would launch right then. And the Army pilots got in their planes, and these people who had never once taken off from an aircraft carrier had to do it. And it must have been a harrowing experience, particularly for Doolittle, as experienced a pilot as he was, because it was very bad weather. The wind was blowing rather fiercely. The ship was pitching up and down. It would the bow would go down and then back up, and you had to really have faith, because when the bow was pointed downward, you're looking at water, and the naval officer would give you the signal, go. And the plane is roaring down the deck, heading, looks like straight for the water. But as he's going down the deck, the carrier begins to pitch upward. And just as the carrier gets at its highest point, the airplane reaches the end of the deck and takes off, hopefully. But Doolittle did this. He did take off. He dipped down some after this shot was taken. And there were some anxious moments watching him, and particularly a couple of the others who really dipped down. And at least one of them, their propellers were actually touching the water before they were able to rise up. It's really quite amazing that in these conditions, these pilots that had never once taken off from an aircraft carrier, every one of them did, and they headed into Japan. When they got there, it was much like Pearl Harbor in reverse. Nobody, a lot of people saw the planes, but nobody realized that they weren't Japanese. People were waving to them. They had come in at very low altitude to avoid detection. And they were able to find targets and able to drop their bombs without any of them being shot down. The Japanese didn't have time to get their fighters off the ground. Their anti-aircraft guns were, in most cases, just starting to try to aim when the plane flew on past. The targets they hit were, none of them was a particularly valuable target, but in a couple of cases they hit civilian targets. Some children were killed. The Japanese made a great deal of this after the raid. They talked only about the bombs that had fallen on civilian targets, I think on a hospital or school, and about these barbarian Americans who had come to bomb Japanese civilians. But the planes all successfully left Japan. Not one of them was shot down. One of them was running very low on fuel, and so he headed for Russia. They were managed to land in Russia, where under international law, they had to be interned. And they stayed, I think, for at least a year in Russia. And then they were moved to a location near Iran. And the Russians very quietly let them out. The cover story was that they had escaped and bribed someone to take them across the border. but they made their way out. The pilots, the rest of the pilots, got to the coast of China. A couple of them were shot down there, but most of them got beyond the coast. They were looking for the airfields, and they didn't find any airfields. The airfields were not lit up. They could find no place to land. By now it was dark. They were flying over China in the night. They were running low on fuel, and then they ran out of fuel. And so they bailed out. In Doolittle's case, his crew had all of his crew bail out first and set it on autopilot, and he bailed out. He landed in a field, a farm field that had just been covered with fresh manure. And he landed in that. He was tired, he smelled bad. He had no idea where he was. He found a farmer's house. He knocked on the door and said in Chinese, which he had a little card telling him what to say. The farmer slammed the door in his face. But the next morning, he finally found some soldiers who he was able to convince that he was an American. Similar stories happened to most of the rest of them. A few of them were captured, and it was not a very pleasant captivity. Two, I believe, were put on a sham trial and executed by the Japanese. Most of the others who were captured had very rough time in POW camps, but did survive the war and get back. Doolittle and his crew and most of the other crews found their way to friendly Chinese Army or Air Force locations. Now, Doolittle at this point is convinced that he's going to be court-martialed when he gets back to the United States. He's led a mission with, I think, 19 or 20 planes. He's lost every single plane under his command. I mean, in the pre-war Air Force, if you lost one plane, your career was probably over. But he was very seriously concerned that he would be considered the GOAT of the Air Force. Well, when he got back, he was treated as a hero. This mission did an incredible amount of good for the morale of the Air Force and the American people. He was a lieutenant colonel. The next rank up is colonel, then brigadier general. He was promoted, skipped colonel completely. He was made a brigadier general. He was given the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt himself. And these people here, this is General Marshall, who is the head of the Army, and this is General Hap Arnold watching the ceremony with Doolittle and his wife. He was, as I said, treated as a hero. He was sent on a very successful war-bond tour before going back on active duty. President Roosevelt, when announcing this raid on Japan, was very coy about where it had come from. And there was a very popular book at the time called, I believe, Lost Horizons, which took place in a fictional place in Asia called Shangri-La. And they said, Mr. President, where did these planes come from? They said, they came from Shangri-La. And that name became so famous and popular that later a U.S. aircraft carrier was named the USS Shangri-La. But as I said, this did a tremendous amount of good for the morale of the Air Force and for the entire public of the United States. It was considered even though it had done very little damage to Japan, it was a tremendous morale booster in the United States. The crew, after the war, this crew had reunions every year. They had goblets made for all the survivors, silver goblets that were stored in this case that could be moved around. And each one had the flyer's name engraved on it, right side up and upside down. And when the pilot or when the crew member passed away, the goblet would be turned upside down. So over the years, of course, more and more were turned upside down. I think they had the last reunion in 2013 or 14. The last survivor was Doolittle's co-pilot, Richard Cole, who died just 2 years ago at the age, I think, of 103. And so they're all gone now, but they stuck together as survivors for all those years. Now, after the battle, the Japanese, of course, the Japanese Navy was particularly embarrassed and incensed at this raid. The homeland had been attacked by bombers, and even though the public story to the public was that they had done virtually no damage and it was essentially silliness, the Japanese military and government took it very, very seriously. And they were going to do something. We knew they were, but our fleet we had, I think, 4 carriers in the Pacific at the time. They couldn't be everywhere. The Japanese might strike at Midway. It was very likely they would want to take Midway. They might strike in the Solomon Islands. There was one particular area, an Anchorage, an island called Tulagi, very small island, but a very fine harbor there. They might strike even in Australia, or while they were in possession of the north coast of New Guinea, they might try to take a point on the south coast. Now you wonder why that's just a few miles. Why would that be important to them? Well, it's important because there's a very rugged range of mountains running down the bird's tail in New Guinea. Very difficult for planes to get over. So it would be quite to Japan's advantage to attack Australia or even to invade Australia. And at that time, we were very concerned about an invasion of Australia. The Japanese Navy was wanting an invasion of Australia, but the Army said, we can't do that. There's no way. We don't have we're tied down in China. During all of World War II, something like 3/4 of the Japanese army was tied down in China, where they had captured a lot along the coast, but where the Chinese were holding them back. But we needed to know, how could we find out? We had very fine airplanes that could go a long distance, but they really couldn't go long enough to in order to find out what was going on for the most part. So where do we go? We listen to their communications and we pick up messages like this. These are call signs of a ship or your station, but they're encoded. and the message is encoded. Looks like that can't tell us much, but actually it can tell us a lot, because we set up listening stations around the Pacific. And when you hear the operators heard a transmission, they would log the exact time and the exact bearing from radio direction finding equipment and pinpoint exactly where that ship or shore station was. They did this starting in the 1920s. A Navy radio operator in Hawaii was just listening to random things, and he picked up something strange. It was not Morse code, but it was sort of like Morse code. Well, he kept listening over a period of days and weeks, and he figured out that it was Morse code like alphabet, 40 or so characters, which came to be called the Kana code. The Japanese had come up with a code they could use in their radio transmissions. And these operators, the people who did this, were called the On the Roof Gang. The roof being the roof of the Naval Headquarters building in Washington, a World War I temporary building that was still in use. Indeed, it was still in use after World War II. But these people trained in a shack that was on top of the building, on the roof of the building. And were some maybe of them who trained between 1928 and 1941. The last of them just died last year, I believe. They also are all gone now, but they provided invaluable service in letting us know, after years of work, figured out where each Japanese ship was, what its identity was. They did an amazing job, but still you've got the message itself, which is in code. What do you do with that? Well, the Navy developed absolutely fine group of code breakers, and the person who really started the effort and led it for many years was this woman, Agnes Meyer Driscoll. She taught the trade to most of the Navy's early code breakers, and she worked through World War II. She was absolutely amazing, brilliant beyond belief, really, in her ability to crack codes and to enable us to read messages. She taught the pioneers in that field. One, Lawrence Stafford, who headed the operation officially several times over a period of years. Another, Joseph Rochefort, who had a very fascinating background. In 1917, he was a high school student in Los Angeles. He finished all his courses. He was eligible for graduation, but between the end of classes and graduation, he was so anxious to get in the service that he volunteered for the Navy, never went to his graduation, never even got his high school degree. They had a program where enlisted men could apply for officer training. There were 2 or 3 of these programs. My grandfather was in one of those, and listening to him talk about it, it was incredibly difficult, the academic part, for someone who had not been to college. My grandfather had not even been to high school, but he managed to get through the program. Rochefort also managed to get through the program and was commissioned an officer and became a career officer in the Navy. Now, the Navy rule at that time, if an officer wanted to be promoted, you had to spend about half your time on sea duty. So Rochefort and Stafford would alternate. One would take over the cryptographic operations, the other would go off on sea duty for several years. Well, by 1941, Joe Rochefort was a commander and head of all radio intelligence operations in Hawaii, including the traffic analysis, traffic radio intercept, and code breaking. And Rochefort was probably one of the best code breakers that ever lived. He was extremely good at it. They put together a team of people who, some of whom probably wouldn't do all that well anywhere else, in the military, even in civilian life. What we would call nerds today, but people who had incredible brains and who were incredibly good at the business of code breaking. He was overworked, understaffed. He did some unusual things to try to get help. He had a chief petty officer, one of those people, if you've been in the service, you hope you get a sergeant or chief petty officer who knows how to work the system. He doesn't do anything that's absolutely illegal, but he can bend the rules. He knows how to get things done. Well, Rochefort had one of those. He sent him looking around. They found that the band from the battleship California, which had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, had nothing to do. He managed to get them all transferred to Rochefort's operation. Most or all of them were there for the rest of the war and performed some very valuable functions. It was a collection of unusual people, but unusually brilliant people. And they had a sign that hung up there. This is not the actual sign, but this is what it says. You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps. And they were unusual people doing unusual work, but they were really good at it. Now you can break codes and come up with your idea of what the message says, but it doesn't help if the right people don't listen. Rochefort was very lucky, and the United States was very lucky, because he and a naval officer named Edwin Layton had been sent to Japan in the early 1930s to learn the language and the culture. They were there 2 years. This was really intense learning time. They had to learn the language in great detail, learn as much as they could, which was difficult about the use of the Japanese language by the military. But they had become great friends. Now, by 1941, Layton, he was not an admiral then, he was a commander, but he was the chief intelligence officer on Admiral Nimitz staff, the Pacific Fleet Command. Layton had gained Nimitz total confidence, and Layton had total confidence in Rochefort, so that Layton was sure that the information he was getting from Rochefort was good. Nimitz was sure the information he was getting from Layton was good, which was an incredible help over the next few months. Rochefort and his group had been working on a Japanese code that hadn't been broken before, but they got it now. They didn't totally break the code. It wasn't like they had an exact duplicate of the code books, but they could get bits and pieces. And Rochefort would get enough bits and pieces that he would fill in the blanks. Now, I think if Admiral Nimitz had known exactly what Rochefort was doing, he might have been not quite so sure that Rochefort had it right, because a lot of it was almost guesswork. They did get enough of the message to say, okay, well, I got these 3 words, the next word must be so-and-so. And he pieced together what he thought was going on. This time in late April 1942, he came to several conclusions from the traffic that he had analyzed. He concluded before we knew it any other way, the Japanese had occupied Tulagi, which had an outstanding natural harbor, no room, land airfield, but seaplanes could operate there and ships could anchor there. He concluded that Japanese would move from 2 different places. Truk, which was a major base for Japan. Truk is an atoll surrounded by a coral reef, very large area with enough solid land for airfield, and the lagoon made a huge harbor. They could have gotten the entire Japanese Navy in the lagoon at Truk. He concluded they were going to move ships, probably aircraft carriers, from Truk to the Coral Sea. Oops, keep doing that. Also, Rabaul was another excellent anchorage with land enough for airfields nearby that Japan had seized a couple of months earlier and made into a major base. They concluded that there were going to be ship movements from Rabaul to the Coral Sea. And he concluded from all this that the target was going to be Port Moresby on the south coast of New Guinea. As I mentioned, these mountains made it very difficult to operate from the airfields the Japanese already had, but with Port Moresby, airfield there, they'd be able to attack Australia easily, perhaps even invade Australia. So this became very important to us to do anything we could, if we could do anything, to defeat this move to capture Port Moresby. Nimitz decided to send all of his available aircraft carriers to the Coral Sea. Admiral Halsey had 2 carriers, but they were still just coming back from the Doolittle mission, and Nimitz realized they couldn't make it in time. So he only had 2 carriers, but he sent them the Lexington, which was an old carrier, the Yorktown, a fairly new carrier. If the Japanese were sending only 2 carriers, it could be an even fight, fairly even fight in the Coral Sea. The American force was commanded by this man, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who he was not an aviator. He was strictly a surface commander, but he was the most senior officer in this group, And so he commanded it. And he's someone who some people think he's very much underappreciated for what he did, in particular in 1942. And others figured that very little credit was just right for Admiral Fletcher. And people still argue about that. But he was in command. Now, as I said, we sent our carriers from Hawaii. They rendezvoused at the eastern edge of the Coral Sea. The Japanese carriers came from Truk into the Coral Sea this way. An invasion fleet came from Rabaul to go around the tail of the bird to Port Moresby. Now, it's pretty obvious there's going to be a battle. This is the battle. Now, I could ask you all to memorize this chart, and then we could very easily talk about it, but it may be a little bit too busy, the chart, to do that with. So let's try to make it more simple. The Lexington and Yorktown are get in the Coral Sea early in May. It's decided to strike Tulagi. There are reports that there are Japanese ships there. So the Lexington launches a strike. The aviators get total surprise. They see a number of ships. They see a lot of splashes as their bombs exploded. They report back some fairly significant hits on sinkings of ships and damage to ships. Turned out that, as so often happened with reports from aviators on both sides, they greatly overestimated the results. The cruisers that they reported sinking were destroyers, and destroyers were little minesweepers. But it had a great morale effect on the pilots, especially those who had not flown in combat before, to make this strike. Now, one thing this did was to let the Japanese know that there's at least one U.S. carrier somewhere nearby that might be up here north of Tulagi, or it might be down in the Coral Sea, but they knew that there was at least one. But that's all they knew. Now, the next couple of days, the U.S. forces, Admiral Fletcher's forces, had to refuel, and this is always a problem for naval forces, especially at long distances. Ships take a lot of fuel. The planes on the ships take a lot of fuel, and they have to have what the Navy would call oilers, oil tankers that refuel the ships on their way. And they have to do this every few days. They had a couple of oilers with the fleet that were standing, hopefully, out of range of enemy aircraft. So on May the 4th, or May the 7th, I'm sorry, the forces got into action. One of the first things that Fletcher did, and there was a lot of criticism of this after the fact, he sent a lot of his surface ships, including a couple cruisers, out on a mission with no air cover to stand by to fight the invasion fleet if our carriers were sunk or badly damaged. Now, this was a fleet of both Australian and U.S. forces, ships, commanded by this man, Admiral John Crace, who was from the British Navy, the Royal Navy. Now, his unit was indeed attacked by aircraft. First, the Japanese attacked them. They managed to maneuver and use their anti-aircraft guns very effectively, and no hits were scored. They thought, well, that's fine. We're out of the woods on that one. Then some U.S. Army Air Corps planes spotted them. And because of poor communications, coordination, they assumed they were Japanese, and they attacked. And they scored no hits. And in fact, their performance was so poor that, and I've been looking, I can't find the exact quote, but Admiral Crace said that the safest place to be in the Pacific Ocean is underneath American Army Air Corps bombers that are trying to hit you. Their performance was, in his opinion, atrocious. And of course, he was quite happy about that because he had survived yet another attack. After sending the cruisers off, Fletcher sent search planes in various directions. One of them found a force which, through a communications error, they saw two cruisers. They said they saw two aircraft carriers. Well, he sent a major strike looking for this force. I found out when they were well underway that the message had been an error, that he hadn't spotted any aircraft carriers, but he let the strike go onward, and they did in fact find what was the invasion force, and there was an aircraft carrier. It was a small carrier, what's called a light carrier, carried like 20-some airplanes there to cover the invasion force. Well, our pilots were ecstatic at the idea of having an aircraft carrier as a target. They hit it with bombs, they hit it with torpedoes. Fairly early on, it should have been obvious to anyone that the ship was fatally damaged. But they were so enthusiastic, they kept hitting it. Plane after plane, unit after unit, descended and put enough torpedoes and bombs into this one little carrier to sink practically every carrier in the Japanese Navy, which was not a smart thing to do at all. And our system then, there was not anyone in total command of the aircraft who could have and should have made the decision, hey, this is enough, don't hit it with anything more. But our planes were now low on weapons. If we had found the Japanese fleet, the bigger carriers, and had been close enough to hit them, we wouldn't have much to hit them with. But these pilots were absolutely ecstatic about the hitting a carrier. And indeed, it was a significant thing. It was the first time in the war that American pilots had sunk a Japanese aircraft carrier. And one of the heads of the squadrons radioed back, "Scratch one flat top." And that became, got everybody extremely excited. And while it did a lot for the morale of the aviators, it had not been a good idea to put so much of our ordnance into that one ship. But while that one was scratched, there were a couple more that weren't. And the Japanese carrier force was very close to the US. They had for several days they had been quite close to one another, but they hadn't found each other. The Japanese had sent out searches. One of them found what was reported back to be an aircraft carrier. The Japanese admiral sent a huge strike at this aircraft carrier. Well, they got there and they found that it was not a carrier, it was an oiler, a tanker with just one destroyer. Well, the Japanese attacked it anyway, but the big difference in the way they operated, they had a commander of all the planes. One person was designated to command all the attacking planes. When he saw that there were enough hits to sink the ship, he stopped it. And so they conserved their weapons. They still had enough weapons. If they had found our carriers, they could have launched a devastating strike. But they didn't find our carriers either on that day. So the end of the day, on May the 7th, we had sunk one carrier, but something very important happened. The Japanese commander, overall commander, was concerned about the invasion force having lost its covering air carrier, about carriers being in the distance. They turned back instead of going on and conducting the invasion. On May the 8th, each of the carrier forces sent out searches. This time they found each other. And the Japanese launched a strike. The Americans launched a strike. And they had the chance, hopefully, to do damage or even sink the enemy's carriers. The Japanese had two carriers. They were its two newest aircraft carriers, Shokaku and Zoikaku. They had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, and they were very potent carriers. The American forces found them fairly easily. One of them was almost into cloud cover. There was a rainstorm, but the second one, the Shokaku, was out in the open. They hit it several times with bombs, and they didn't sink it, but they did enough damage that it could not be used to launch planes. They could still recover some of their planes. They lost a fair number of pilots during this engagement of this day. And indeed, this carrier retired because of the damage. The Japanese found the two American carriers and attacked them. The Lexington was hit particularly hard, although it looked like they were going to be able to constrain the damage. One thing our Japanese did several things better than we did at this stage in the war, but one thing we did better was to control damage. I think the Japanese looked at that as secondary importance. You want to go out and fight. You want to be shooting at people, not fixing the damage on your own ship. But we recognized how important it was. Our sailors were trained and were able to put out fires and do temporary repairs, even to a flight deck. But just about when it looked like they were going to be able to control things, some gasoline fumes were leaking from one of the hits. There was a generator which should have been shut off before, but it was still running. The spark from that started an explosion, which caused additional explosions, and finally an ammunition magazine. And the Lexington was fatally damaged. They had to abandon ship. Sailors did it in a very orderly manner. A lot of them, they took off their shoes, but they lined them up on the deck like they were going to be coming back. But almost all of the crew got off of Lexington, but the ship had to be sunk by one of our own destroyers in order to keep the Japanese from capturing it. This is an actual picture of the massive explosion which put the Lexington under the Coral Sea. The Yorktown was also hit. A lot of damage. You can see here they're trying to do an emergency repair to some damage to the flight deck. There was damage to the island of the carrier. The ship was hit pretty badly, although it was not in danger of sinking, but it was going to require a lot of repairs. It was going to be out of the war for several months in order to get repaired. It needed things that couldn't be done at Pearl Harbor. It would have to go back to the West Coast. And with that, the battle ended. The Battle of the Coral Sea was over. And what were the results of this first aircraft carrier battle? In fact, it was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never saw each other. All of the fighting was done with airplanes that launched from carriers which were well out of sight of the enemy fleet. The tactical losses in the battle. We had a large aircraft carrier sunk, the Lexington. The Japanese lost a much smaller aircraft carrier. Our only other aircraft carrier in the battle was damaged, fairly badly damaged. The Japanese side, only one of the carriers was damaged, but it was damaged to the extent that if there were to be a battle in the next month or so, it wasn't going to be able to participate. The repairs would keep it out of that battle. Pilots. We lost fairly few pilots. Our pilots did extremely well in that battle, despite having most of them no combat experience, some of them a little bit. The Japanese lost more pilots, but even more important, it's very difficult for the Japanese to replace pilots. Once they trained a pilot, he was extremely good, but it took a couple of years to train them in the way that they had been training them. And they weren't going to be able to add a whole lot of pilots over the next year or 2 years, whereas the United States had geared up training programs so that we could train thousands of pilots to be able to operate off aircraft carriers. And they were going to be coming on in the next months, and especially in the next few years. Other losses, we lost an oiler, and that could be very significant. In fact, that was one reason that our ships had to get out of the Coral Sea once the battle was over, because if we lost the only other oiler, they would have had a very difficult time refueling and getting anywhere. The Japanese had lost a few small ships in our raid on Tulagi. So looking at the damages that the ships and personnel, the Japanese came out ahead. A lot of writers have talked about this as the Japanese having won a tactical victory as far as what happened to the ships that were actually involved, and that's true. But a much more important thing was, did we achieve our purpose? And the purpose of sending our carriers, the purpose of fighting the Battle of the Coral Sea, was to prevent the invasion of Port Moresby. And that happened. The Japanese invasion force at first turned back to get out of carrier range, and then the invasion was called off. There was concern by the regional commander that it was going to be too risky to subject that invasion force to U.S. carriers. Of course, they weren't real sure. They thought they had done a lot of damage, but you can never be 100% sure. So the most significant result of the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the one which I think is by far the most important, is that we achieved our goal. We achieved what we set out to do, which was to prevent the Japanese from capturing Port Moresby, from putting themselves in a much better position to conduct air raids on Australia and even to invade Australia. So we have an end to a very significant battle, and one which probably would get more attention in the future, but for one that happened barely a month later. But it was a significant victory. It gave our aviators much confidence in their ability to fight the Japanese. The Japanese were no longer looked at as this unstoppable force of giants who could over us. And with that, I think we will have to end the story for now. We'll take up what happens next at the next lesson, which will be a week from today. And I will now take any questions or comments. It looks like there are 12. Well, the first comment is somebody hears someone shuffling papers. Now, okay, here's a good question from Paul. Where did the Army Air Force planes come from? And there were both search planes, which I haven't mentioned, and the bombers which attacked the U.S. surface fleet. They came from Australia. We had bases there which were used and were very important, very useful in conducting air searches of the Japanese occupied areas. And they had a number of bombers which were able to attack them. Let's see. Now this. Okay, we got a lot of comments about people not being muted. Can somebody cannot hear? Oh, Peter Zimmerman, were you able to hear it, Peter? Maybe he's still muted. I hope that I hope the rest of you were able to hear. All right, does anyone have any questions or comments that you'd like to make at this point?
Well, Mike, I would just like to thank you. Your courses are always good, and I had to look up a map of the South Pacific to see where everything was.
Well, I very much appreciate the comment, Melissa, and I've tried to put in enough maps that you can get an idea of where things are. But it's a good idea to go back and look on a map because there are a lot of places involved. It's a very big ocean. If you've got a globe, it's one of the best things to start with, because the Pacific is an ocean that really ought to be viewed on a globe, not on a flat map. But it is good to have one. And maybe something for me to do in these courses is to post a map somewhere that you could get it and print it out and have it there to look at. But I think it's a very good comment. As I said, I do put maps in. It's been hard to find really good maps that show up well in a slide. Some of them are just too busy. Some of them, the text is too faint to read. I've done an awful lot of adding my own text to maps, but your comment is very good and well taken.
I have found using a microscope, a little microscope that I have on the maps really helps because you can't usually read the
Yeah.
And so this little this helps me. I keep it near me.
Fine glass, and I had never thought of that.
Yes, but you can put it up to your screen, and I couldn't tell for sure that was New Guinea, and I used this, and then I could read that it was New Guinea. So it was helpful.
So I will look over for my future lessons and see if I can do anything to improve the maps or to get improved.
It's great though. The maps are great help because I don't know much about that part of the country, of the world.
And I was interested in how close Japan, China, New Guinea, where all these places were and that these pilots were flying. It was amazing.
When you see this Battle of the Coral Sea, you can see why the Australians and Americans are really so friendly still, because that battle obviously protected their country and continent.
It did, yes. They were very vulnerable. They felt themselves extremely vulnerable. One reason, because while they had a lot of troops mobilized, they were in the Middle East and North Africa, Europe, and it would take a long time to get them back.
Yeah.
And they felt extra vulnerable. And we, to help with that, we did several things. One, sent our ships to prevent the capture of Port Moresby, but also sent a number of troops there and sent a few trips, a lot of airplanes, but that was something very important. And the overall aspects of the war was to keep the Australians calm and feel that they were really being protected.
Yeah.
And not. Or do we have any other comments?
I will say that it is really sad that some people just don't get to turn off their mic. For the most part, everything was fine, but they don't seem to understand that when they don't turn off their mic, other people can't hear besides hearing their conversations.
Well, I think that's very true. In fact, Larry, if you're still on, I think that either you or I can mute everyone. And we probably should do that next time. Once the lesson starts, you'll always be able to use your chat feature to make comments or raise issues. But
interestingly, I noticed many have now muted after you finished.
Yes.
or West, because you can just look at the one and user, whoever that is. They all muted now, so I don't know how that.
Uh, Well, we'll have to see what we can do about that for future lessons.
Other
Listen,
people,
I really, go ahead, Mary.
other people have. Larry has muted that before when some for the leader.
Yeah.
He
I'm not
said-
sure.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if Larry's listening. If he mutes all, he probably mutes you too, Michael.
Oh, could be.
Yeah, that I know if I'm doing it with, if I'm the leader doing it with my own Zoom, which
Yeah.
is not very trustworthy, that I know I can do it. We'll have to ask. Larry, are you still there? Are you hiding now?
Looks like
He probably left because the course ended.
I'll talk to Larry about that and see.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because yeah, it is when somebody not knowing that they're doing it is having a phone conversation that we're all hearing, it does interrupt the whoever's speaking.
I tell you, this whole course, Mike, I have learned so much more about the war in the Pacific than I really ever knew. And my father was in the Merchant Marine Academy at the time. So he was a midshipman and sent out on tankers. And my whole life he'd say, oh, I was in Shanghai, I was in wherever I was. And after taking your course, I'm like, oh my God, he left out the fact he was on a cruise and went to all of those places. And after taking your course, I was like, oh, I get it now, it was a cruise. So I asked him, fortunately, he lived till about 2 years ago. And he said, yeah, that is what it was. He goes, and when my first cruise was done, he said, of course, we were afraid we were always going to you didn't want to be on the side because the ships would go in, scores of ships at the same time, 4 ships wide and 20 long or something. And he said, you'd always hope to be in the middle, not on the sides, because the torpedoes would get the people on the sides. And then if somebody was got, you'd be okay. Are we the ones going out there? That they were worried about it. But after that cruise was over, they said to him, okay, you're going back to Panama, you're going home. And they went back to the Panama Canal and he's expecting to go back home. He had started in New York and left from Raritan, New Jersey, and then went through the canal and went over there. And he said when he got back to the Panama Canal, he's like, oh, good, we're going home. And they said, no, see that ship over there? You have to get on that one. You're going back to where you just came from. They sent him back to where he had been.
Go
ahead.
That raises a very good point. The importance of the merchant marine, and I think that's often overlooked in talking about World War II. They were exposed to great risks because these convoys, like he was in, where you wanted to be on the inside, not everybody could be, and the Germans in particular were very good early in the war. Their submarine operations, they sunk a lot of merchant ships. And when you're in bitter cold weather in the North Atlantic, the ship gets sunk and you're in the water. Most of them didn't last long.
Yeah,
it was very risky, and these people did a great service. We couldn't have won the war without the merchant marine that was taking goods, fuel, everything to Europe and to Hawaii and to Australia. We just couldn't have run the war without the effort that these merchant marine people.
He told another story that was interesting, which was, he said, oh yeah, we were a tanker, so we had all that. He said, but we would have something put on the ship that was like for a certain general or some other big mucky muck. He said one thing we had were refrigerators that you had to guard to make sure those refrigerators went nowhere because they were waiting for their part of America, wherever they were over in the Pacific, to get a refrigerator.
Yes, there were lots of situations like that. There were some boxes marked extra special going to Admirals, which if somebody had gotten inside, there were a lot of bottles of scotch or